This is an introduction to understanding WennSoft's use of equipment and preventative maintenance tasking. I always like to begin with the definition of terms. When we talk about a location in the WennSoft software, this is the building where the equipment is located and where the technician's work will be done. Equipment is contained within that building, and it's simply all of the things that we will be doing preventative maintenance work on. Components are parts of a larger equipment ID. We'll talk in more detail about this later, but components don't necessarily get preventative maintenance done on them themselves. The preventative maintenance is the larger piece of equipment. Equipment type is a generic description of the unit's function. We use equipment types to tie to preventative maintenance task lists, and this is an important link within the software that we'll talk about in greater detail later. Task codes are simply the steps done in a preventative maintenance task list. It defines the work to be done, such as change filters, change belts, inspect electrical connections, and those types of things. Subtasks are a part of task codes that simply give us a list of order of operations and the steps to perform the specific task. Task responses are used within the system to capture data related to the maintenance of that equipment, such as voltage readings, amperage, temperatures, pressures, and anything that we want to record to report back to the customer will be recorded by using task responses. Task materials would be the specific inventory items or even non-inventory items that would define things like filter sizes and quantities, belt sizes and quantities, all of those types of things. And then finally, a task list is a group of task codes assembled together to form the entirety of the preventative maintenance to be done. It's very important to understand that each equipment type has a one-to-one relationship to a task list that'll be performed for maintenance purposes. This is an image of the location window within the system. Very important to understand that the address 1 field should always be the street address of the building. We should never enter a suite number or a unit number in that field, because that'll affect Google Maps' ability to properly capture the latitude and longitude of the location. Latitude and longitude can be acquired using an API utility within WennSoft's schedule software. It could also be acquired while a technician is on site using mobile tech, or by looking the site up in Google Maps and manually typing in the latitude and longitude into the location window. Equipment. This window here describes the individual equipment, the location where that equipment is located. The equipment ID in the WennSoft software is not really important. It's simply a unique identifier. I always point to the equipment description, which should be the customer's definition of that piece of equipment. So if the customer has their own numbering system or naming convention to describe their equipment, we would want to enter it in this equipment description field. Other fields here, building ID and room number. These are ways to identify a building that might not have a street address. For example, if you're working in a small college campus, the main building on campus might have a regular street address, but other smaller buildings surrounding it might not. So we could identify the building as the library and the room, the basement boiler room, and that would allow our technician who's going on site to more quickly get to the area where the equipment is located so he can get his work done. Equipment type. We describe things using this generic name, such as air handling unit, condensing unit. Those equipment types should always be selected from the pre-existing list, and that list needs to be maintained very closely because we don't want to have different spellings of the same thing. It should be always linked to a task list that is clearly defined and agreed upon by the management team. Manufacturer ID, that's self-explanatory. Again, there's a lookup there, and users should always be picking off of the existing list. Not every equipment manufacturer of small equipment or infrequently used equipment needs to be added to this list, but obviously major manufacturers are always going to be there. And if we do have a situation where we're adding significant quantities of equipment by a new manufacturer, we should certainly take the time to add that manufacturer ID into the list. Model numbers change frequently. There is a lookup there. You can look up a model number, but typically we're going to manually type that model number in because they are so diverse from one manufacturer to the next. Serial number, that's self-explanatory. It's an alphanumeric data entry field. Sublocation ID is another identifier for each equipment ID to identify where that equipment is located within the building. Now, sublocation spelling should be tightly controlled. I prefer to always spell rooftop, R-O-F-F-T-O-P, with no space, and it should be entered consistently so that in mobile tech, when the technicians are working on equipment, they would see that rooftop, all the rooftop units grouped together by sublocation, and that way when they go to the rooftop to do maintenance on all the rooftop units, they could see that there's units 1 through 6, and all the maintenance that needs to be done could be done in those on those units. Next, they would perhaps go down to the 4th floor equipment room and work on the 3 different air handler units that are within that sublocation. So again, sublocation is a way to get the technician to the place where the work needs to be done and easily see all of the equipment that is in that area of the building. All of the fields on the lower side of this window are related to the original installation, when the warranty expires, if there's an extended warranty, when does that expire. Those are not required fields, but obviously if we know that information, it's helpful for a technician to have access to it. And certainly if we're going to install a new piece of equipment, we should take the time to enter these details because the software will track warranty and warranty dates. A component uses the same equipment ID window, but notice the third step down is a component ID and then the master equipment ID that it's tied to. Now this would be commonly used for compressor replacement or a large component of a piece of equipment that's being replaced that will have its own warranty cycle. So the component itself does not get a maintenance task list, but it will have its own warranty cycle. And it's important that dispatchers know and invoicing clerks know that this particular service call was for a piece of equipment that's under warranty and therefore we shouldn't bill for it. This is a sample of the equipment type setup window. You can see we've just got an air handling unit and it's tied to a task list ID called AHU. Now there are some other fields on this window: manufacturer ID, equipment model number, and then some filters labeled system, major, sub 1 through 4. Now, although the WennSoft software is capable of having a specific equipment type tied specifically to a manufacturer ID and model number, in my experience, it's not really fruitful to take the time to enter those details because next year that model may change and we'd have to rebuild an equipment type and task list to go with it. So we use generic equipment types that would cross the boundaries of manufacturers and model numbers and be generic. However, the task list can be modified when we get to the contract level, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. This is our task code window. It's important to note that task codes must have a unique ID. The task code unique identifier is limited to 10 characters, but we need to focus more on the task description. So that would be the description of the work to be done, and that can be up to 60 characters long. Skill level will help to match technicians with the right skills to do that job. For example, we might want helper technicians to always do coil cleanings, and therefore the coil cleaning task code could be tied to the helper skill level. Material kits, items, and toolkits, these are just simple lookup fields that might describe the need for a special tool to do this specific task. I don't frequently add those into the system, but they are available if need be. Frequency, you can see here, is 3 months. But when we choose a quarterly frequency of every 3 months, we must then choose the schedule and define, does that 3-month cycle begin in January, February, or March? Similarly, if we choose every 6 months, we must then choose which 6 months of the year, or which of the first 6 months of the year will we have our first visit. The corresponding months would be 6 months later. We saw these filters on the equipment type list. These filters will help to sort out long lists of task codes in the system. In my experience, most HVAC companies will not have more than a couple hundred task codes in the list, and most of those task codes will cross boundaries of different types of equipment, and so filtering them using these filters, is not really needed in most HVAC environments. We do have the ability to define estimated hours and costs for materials and labor on any given task code. Typically within the system, with that estimating time and materials costs would be done in the CRM system. And so we don't take the time to enter those things in the WennSoft task codes. This is an example of a list of subtasks. In the previous screens, you saw that I was using an oil change task as an example. So when we click on the subtasks button and open this window, it gives the order of operations when we're changing oil in a vehicle. Remove drain plug, remove filter, replace drain plug, and replace filter, then filled with oil. If we fail to do the steps in this order, we might likely end up with oil on the garage floor. And finally, the last step would be to check oil pressure. The task responses window shows this section on the right that is dedicated to a WennSoft module for vehicle repairs. This is not typical in any HVAC environment, and so we can ignore that part of the window and focus primarily on the list of task responses. You can see here we only have one task response to record the oil pressure, but there are 9 possible task responses, and so as we're building out task codes, we could build out a variety of responses using these different response types. A string is simply an entry of 30 characters or less, alphanumeric. A numeric string has a decimal place, and it's always 5 characters following the decimal. Integer would be a whole number. Yes, no would be a response where the technician would have to pick yes or no to a question that is being asked. So when you're entering the label of the task response, that would be the question you're formulating, and the technician then would answer it. When you're creating yes/no responses, you would want to create perhaps a series of questions that would always be answered yes, and therefore when you're scanning the responses given by the technician, a negative answer would jump out at you very easily. A list is a drop-down list that we could create. We might label that list, what is the condition of the unit, and then build a list that says good, fair, poor, needs replacement, and the technician then could select from that list. Repair is a response type dedicated to the vehicle repair module that I talked about, not relevant in the mechanical contracting world. A date would allow the technician to use a calendar lookup to select a specific date on the calendar, and that might be related to the date of the last state inspection or something to that effect. These are the task code task materials. So again, referring back to our oil change example, we would choose 5 quarts of 10W40 oil and a Fram F150 oil filter for this particular oil change. When we are building a task list, we would open the task list window, give it a name. In this case, we're referring back to our AHU, air handling unit. You can see again, the filters are available there if you do have an excessive number of task codes and you want to filter the list down. But what we see on the left is a list of all task codes within the system. To build the list on the right, I simply would select and highlight on the left the task code I want to add and click the Insert button. As I build the list, you can see the hierarchy, the order of operations that this task list would be performed in, and I could highlight a task on the right side, and using the order up-down arrows on the far right, I could move a task up or down in the list. Similarly, I could highlight a task on the right and remove it from this list. Some important notes. The task codes and task responses are very useful tools, but we want to make sure that we're not being excessive in the amount of data we're asking our technicians to collect in the field. We don't want to turn our technicians into data entry clerks typing with their thumbs into a cell phone. We want to make sure that we're only capturing relevant information that perhaps would give us a marketing edge over our competition, or data that might be relevant to selling more predictive repairs. One example of a customer that I've worked with in the past that did a wonderful job of using mobile tech task responses as a marketing tool, encourage their salespeople to use it and display to their customers the types of reports they would get back when a preventative maintenance was done. It was a very effective marketing tool for them. Similarly, things like bearing vibration readings on large motors. A trend analysis looking back over several months of readings that have happened might lead us to see that a bearing is perhaps ready to fail, and that way we could be proactive about changing out that bearing. Voltage and amperage readings are another indicator that perhaps the amperage draw is too high. We might want to consider replacing a motor. The other valuable thing that can be done with tasking, we saw our estimated hours. We typically don't get so granular that we're putting in hours estimates for every individual task code, but we can use an hours estimate for the site visit as a whole for any given month of the preventative maintenance contract. And by capturing our estimated hours, we can then compare to the actual hours worked by the technicians as they're doing the work and entering their time into Mobile Tech. Thank you.